My oldest daughter, Katie, no relation, is getting married to this guy for some reason. And she asked me if I could make her a cross for the wedding ceremony. So now I'm stuck. I gotta get this thing done quick so I can get back to watching cat videos. Alright, think, you handsome devil! How can I get this thing done like yesterday so she shuts her yapper? By Garfield's whiskers, I've got it. Well, guess the cat videos would have to wait. This is what it looked like before I started working it, which is pretty crazy. It's amazing that you could go from this to this. I'm always amazed at what you can uncover when you peel away the first layer, I guess. It's all water stained and dirty from sitting out in the pile for all this time, since I cut it into lumber from that log in the farmer's field. It doesn't look like anything. It looks like something you'd throw away. It really only takes a couple of passes over the joiner to reveal some pretty spectacular grain. I think generally speaking, we're so disconnected from the source of the materials that we use. We're used to just buying materials that are pretty much in their final form. And so it can be difficult to recognize the possibilities that lie beneath the surface. There's a whole series of steps between the tree that grows in the forest and the lumber that you buy at a lumber mill. And largely woodworkers are disconnected from that. And I would say the same, it's kind of similar to our food. Food comes from grocery stores. It's not associated with animals somehow in a lot of people's minds, even people that know better. Lumber comes from lumber yards, not from trees. That's the subconscious view of things. I feel like it can be difficult for your typical woodworker to look at this piece of wood, for example, and understand the possibilities that lie within in terms of grain structure and strength and other properties. I'm kind of lazy, so I really didn't want to do a glue up for this project, but I also did want the symmetry of book matching, so I reluctantly decided to take the extra time. Like pretty much every other woodworker, I guess, I'm a James Krenoff nerd, and I recall reading a quote from him that had to do with letting a given piece of wood dictate the project instead of trying to force the wood grain to conform to whatever project you already had in mind. And that's really resonated with me since the time I read it years ago. And so sometimes when I'm taking a look around the wood pile, I do a little dreaming of what I might make with some really interesting board. Of course, none of this has anything to do with what I did here, since in this case, I pretty much did the opposite of what Krenoff said. It is a great philosophy, though. Unless I'm cutting dovetails, I generally use machines like the table saw or the bandsaw to do the rough work. And then I'll use some combination of hand tools for the finishing touches. I just like having the control that the use of hand tools gives you. Using exclusively a power tool for fine joinery is not only clearly a moral atrocity and should obviously be punished with instant death, it's also just terrifying. You let your guard down for 1 nanosecond and suddenly all your hopes and dreams are reduced to splinters. Not me, that's just like what I've heard from other people. As you can see here, I left about, not quite 1/4 of an inch of material here so that I can use a chisel and a mallet and get that down to the scribed line. I wanted to be exact with this thing so it's a tight fitting joint, and I didn't want to take a chance on the table saw where there's a tendency to overdo it by a millimeter and then ruin your project. It's not like welding where you can just add metal if you screw up. All this talk of the misuse of power tools reminds me of a story my friend Dave told me years ago when we were both soldiers in Germany. We'd spend huge amounts of our own free time in the public woodshop on base, And he told me one day he watched a guy spend hours and hours on this elaborate scroll saw project. And when he was done with all the scroll saw work, he decided the piece of wood itself was a bit too thick. So he took it over to the thickness planer to shave it down a bit. Well, let's just say the planer shaved it down a lot. And I remember dying laughing as Dave described the sound made by the thousands of pieces of that guy's project as they rattled their way through the metal ductwork on their way to the dust collection bin. I do realize this is a straw man and no one is actually making the argument that this is how you use power tools, but still, it is a funny story. Well, I mean, probably not for that guy, I guess. Steel is such a cool material. It's kind of expensive, but small price to pay for such a fabulous building material as far as I'm concerned. It was too expensive to produce in quantity until about the mid-1800s, but now you can go down to your corner metal supermarket and get almost literally whatever you want, which perfectly illustrates how unprecedented in human history is our access to any material or tool that we can imagine, and many that we've never even dreamed of. Here I'm sanding out the marks from the cutting wheel. That's my oldest son in the background practicing welding up T-joints, which I think is pretty cool actually. But, you know, don't tell him I said that. For a while after I started metalworking, I tried to come up with a way of putting an even bevel on metal in the same way you do with wood to refine the edge. Hand files and angle grinders just didn't cut it for me. It just never looked quite right. And then at some point, I randomly came across this video describing this little $65 tool that does exactly that. And what a difference in my workflow it's made. I mean, look at that gorgeous bevel. And I think it's all the more striking with steel because with steel, that angle really emphasizes the light contrast between the surface and the bevel. And that's especially true when you put a clear finish on the steel as opposed to coloring it. A big part of the character of this grain comes from the fact that the logs these came from had already begun the process of rotting. These pieces have parts that are on the razor edge of usability. It's interesting that there's often a super fine line between really interesting and completely useless, whether you're talking about woodworking or metalworking or people for that matter. Toward the bottom of this glue up, you can see the grain has almost crossed that line. I wouldn't want to use this to make a sailing ship, obviously, but for decorative purposes, I think it works pretty well. It definitely calls for very sharp tools because it's fairly soft and brittle. The very first time I heard the notion of making holes in steel with steel drill bits, I was like, you can't drill a hole through steel. I've drilled a lot of holes since then, and it blows my mind every time that this is even possible. Every time I don't break a tap, the hills echo with the sound of much rejoicing. I swear I'm not making this up. Not 5 minutes after I stupidly tempted fate with that statement, guess what happened? I approached tapping holes with a crazy amount of caution because of the nightmare of dealing with a tap breaking off in the material. But it seems to happen more often than it used to, probably because the quality of the steel isn't what it used to be. I mean, we all know it can't be my technique. My technique is flawless. A true artist blames his equipment and materials, I believe they say. I'm not sure why this is so hard for me to admit, but it is. Historically, I have not enjoyed the process of finishing. Compared to cutting joints or otherwise refining a given piece of wood, for some reason I've really struggled with being enthusiastic about the final step, which is finishing. Which is pretty odd, considering how it's actually pretty fundamental to the quality of the project. A subpar finish can easily ruin a piece, even if everything else is perfect. So why the lack of enthusiasm on my part? The truth is, I have no idea. But, you know, obviously, if you want to be a complete craftsman, this is not exactly a sustainable approach. Then, one day I found this guy on YouTube who took the time to explain his own really effective finishing technique that was also somehow stress-free to apply. I know nothing else about this guy. He's probably wanted in half a dozen countries for not returning shopping carts. And I bet he's got a whole glove compartment full of unpaid parking tickets. But I can't really hold any of that against him because, despite his obvious moral depravity, his video really helped me out, and it helped to make finishing actually fun and something that I'm interested in experimenting with now. Again, this is somewhat embarrassing for me to admit, but I don't think it really helps anybody if I try to hide it. Plus, I wanted to give a shout out to the guy who made the video in the first place. His YouTube name is N. Curtis, and I'll leave a link in the description below. The wall mount is just a piece of flat bar, and I'm about to drill and tap some holes to attach 2 magnets. Obviously, this method of hanging the cross wouldn't be an option if it were just made of wood, but the steel makes it a really interesting option for wall mounting. Here I'm marking out the magnet locations and punching holes to guide the drill bits. I actually dropped one of these magnets face down on the table at one point, and I probably spent 2 or 3 minutes trying to pry that thing off the table. That's how strong these rare earth magnets are. It turns out that they had a different setup than I expected when we went to the wedding ceremony rehearsal. I thought the cross would just sit on the ground in front of the altar, but they had a table set up and they wanted to display it on top of the table. So I hadn't planned on that, so I had one half of a morning to come up with an idea how to mount it in a not so terrible looking way. So I didn't have time to film the making of it, but what I did was I used the bandsaw to rough out the form of the base here, and then I refined it on the 2x72 belt sander, and then I heat bent this bracket with my cutting rig, and also did those little accents, the little curve there. Drilled a couple holes, attached that magnetic holder there to it, and that's what I have. I haven't had a chance to put a finish on it yet, but I'm going to match that same one that I put on the actual cross. And then she'll have 2 options. She can mount it on the wall at home, or she can display it on a giant table. trying to record here!
Wow, on today's episode, your son's an idiot. Is it hot? I'm saving that bucket of dirty water for later.
You never know when you're getting a bucket of dirty water. Oh wait, sorry. So that... What? Try to film here!
Up for gymnastics. Same as gymnastics today.
I'm doing stuff right now. I don't care about your little issues with kids or whatever. You figure them out on your own.
So do you either want the baby to stay here with you, or
What
do you
did I
want
just... Dang it. No, whoa. You got me good on that. Wait, I gotta get the expression on my face first.